associate professor. Just got promoted earlier in the year, so congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
So geography and environmental policies where he's at. So the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame, but he's also African Studies Center. He's been working to start an Africa program there, an Africa focus at Notre Dame. So he has interest too in the African Studies Center and how we do things here as well. So, and then a former student, of course, in geography, environment, and spatial sciences here. He's also associated with other centers there at Notre Dame. So the Institute of International Development Studies there, and Global Studies and Geosciences is where he was at Georgia State is where he started out, and then he switched over to Notre Dame. So his three main areas of research that he does, urban water insecurity, and then water policy and governance, and the other part is looking at the gender dynamics of water access. And it's bringing in aspects of health and water quality and nutrition. And now it's moving and integrating climate change as well, agriculture and farming and water. So in terms of theories for the geographers and the political ecology, feminist political ecology, right? Common pool resources, theories, and is some of the political lenses that that Ellis uses. So he's received awards from the Africa Specialty Group of the the American Association of Geographers. So this was like the emerging scholars in African studies. There's also the American Public Health Association, where he got co-recipient of the NABU or Maeda International Research Award. Very well published, lots of major international journals. And he's also frequently sought to comment on things about water and international governance, and also very well engaged in the global environmental governance bodies, UN agencies, the World Bank, and all those agencies that he works with. So, Ellis Adams, welcome.
Thank you.
I must say that I am a married man too. I considered fetching water, but we will hear from you why I must fetch water. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leo. Those online, can they hear me all right? I unmuted myself. I want to make sure they can hear me. Thanks everybody for coming. I'm a family member. I finished MSU here 2016. It's amazing how fast time flies, right? I left for Georgia State University, my first gig as an assistant professor there in the Global Studies Institute and the Department of Geosciences. And I remember getting rid of all my snow boots and my heavy jackets and everything, that bye-bye to the Midwest, I'm done here. And 3 years after, an opportunity came knocking. So my wife and I moved to the University of Notre Dame. She works mainly on maternal health. I work on water. So I'm in the Keough School of Global Affairs, and it's been great with opportunities to continue my research. So thanks everybody. Thanks Leo for your mentoring. I've never regretted being part of SE. It was a great training in human geography in particular to finish here. So mute. It's not on mute.
I was not here.
So what can I do?
Was it muted?
See?
Okay, so that's good. That's good, maybe. So that's good.
That's good?
Yeah, I'll ask
Let me make sure.
Okay.
The screen sharing stopped. Give me a second.
Oh, yeah, we're
share screen again, but I think I lost the screen. Why is the
Screen share is good.
Yes, it's good.
Okay.
okay? Okay. I can't see the screenshot on my end, so, but anyway, I will just continue and. Sorry, there's some mismatch here. Okay, I'll just follow it. So I think Leo's introduction captured well the sort of my large body of work. I want to think about this lecture as just thinking broadly about Africa and water, and some of the major issues are, and then just narrow into the specific areas where my work fits within that broader. So I think this is it's a simplified version of some of the big areas or big problem areas we see with Africa and water. So climate change, obviously, safe drinking water, power conflicts, and governance would be the big areas where my work fits, where I ask the questions that I'm interested in. So what I'm going to do is to just give snippets of work that I do in these domains. And then the last half is going to be all about gender, which is just one aspect of my bigger body of work, okay? So under climate, what are some of the key questions? And again, for each of these papers that I've worked on, there's certainly no time to get into all the details, but I give what is the major takeaway, right? And so there's a tendency to simplify Africa and water as droughts, maybe in the Sahel, droughts in the northern part, but Africa has to also deal with abundant water with the way climatic predictions are going. So flooding is going to be a major issue. So as somebody who is interested in water, the questions that fascinate me around flooding or excess water are really what that would do to communities. And that might be tied to mental health issues around what are people anxious about when it comes to flooding, especially in urban environment where we see this. So a lot of the work I do, I've tried to understand, well, we know flooding causes damage, but within the social fabrics of communities, what can we understand about flooding? And so this work is situated in Ghana, where I try to understand the linkages between flooding and social relations. And just to put it simply, when it comes to social relations and flooding, the good is that you would think that flooding will actually create new relations because people are collaborating to address or to deal with flooding. And we know that from the literature that can happen, right? That you think about Hurricane Katrina, disasters and other things can force new forms of relations where communities are coming together, either in a spontaneous fashion or already existing communal relations might get better, right? In my work, unfortunately, in Ghana, what we discovered is that flooding can also disrupt already established social relations. And that's because there is such communal competition about what to do with the excess water, things like that. And then sort of differentiated vulnerabilities, especially with mothers with young kids and other groups or access of social groups that might be more impacted by flooding. So that's just one example. Okay. And the other question around climate is that what would Africa do in the energy transition, right? And so there is a tendency to think about Africa as the place with a lot of land. And so you would expect that Europe, the Chinese might come to Africa, grab land. We know land grabbing is already a major phenomenon in the region. And so some of the questions I've been interested in is what is Africa's role within the land grab? Or how does water in Africa become a casualty of the climate transition? And you could actually transfer these same questions to things like minerals, right? Lithium mining, or we think about the Congo and mining, things that we need for our transition. So for this specific work, I was very interested in moving away from land grab to land water grabs, really trying to understand what kinds of communal arrangements in terms of chieftaincy, traditional leadership, politics would enable water to be grabbed together with land. And it's happening, and it's very sort of open. So this is northern Ghana in particular, where we situate this work. and we look at, well, what does arrangements to grab land look like and where does water fit in? If you got a contract between an agency or a company from Norway interested in land, did they actually discuss water together with land? And a lot of what we found was that the arrangements were always strictly about land, but there were strategic moves to grab the land where there is easy access to water. So trying to understand, it shouldn't be just easy saying that water is grabbed with land. I think we ought to understand the processes that enable that sort of double grabbing to happen. Okay, so as just one body of work, thinking more broadly about climate change. And I call this land dispossessions and water violations. And then on conflict. So again, I'm just giving a bigger picture of Africa and water and where sort of my work fits. It's by no means exclusively what we are worried about when it comes to water. I'm sure some of you may be aware that farmer-herder conflicts are already a big issue in the region, especially around the Sahel. And so I have a new body of work where I'm looking at how, well, we understand enough about the conflict, but might we understand better how the resolution of those conflicts can become politicized as well, even at a very local level. So for those of you who are geographers, the work here is more about how would water shape the wider geographies of conflicts within the region, right? It's not just about the transboundary conflicts, say, between Ethiopia, Egypt over the Grand Renaissance Dam, for example, but localized conflicts that might be around increased competition over water. How might that emerge and what can we understand about these processes? So this is working in actually middle of Ghana where we are looking at farmer-herder conflicts and how water fits in that body of work. And a lot of what's happening here is really water that formerly was not as, demand for water was less. It's not as much as it is now. So you see water getting repurposed for other things. So you no longer have water exclusively for animals, for example. And when you don't have that and there's increased migration of pastoralists, what ends up happening is that water that was earmarked for domestic use gets now repurposed as water for animals, just sort of dipping in those kinds of processes or conflicts. And this work, I was just talking to you about this work. This is Malawi, still within the African context and climate and water and how this might reinforce communal level conflict. So climate variability and contested land in Malawi is work we've just started that we are hoping to maybe publish a couple of papers and maybe get a grant to expand this work. But the larger question is that when we think about adaptation within the climate literature, I think the tendency is to think about someone comes to help you adapt, right? So there's an adaptation program that's very common. What we are trying to do here is to think about adaptation more broadly and think about adaptation and basically sustainable development goals. In adapting for water or food, are you compromising the other? So the question here is asking how might adaptive systems around one resource that's important compromise another resource that is equally important? It's really what we are trying to think here. And so again, water, soils are becoming drier in at least this part of Malawi, Dowa district where we did this work. So what ends up happening is what the water that you have for domestic use is now what is used for irrigation because soils are drying up and demanding more water for irrigation. So what is the general adaptive system is sort of shifting to create more competition over water. I think I can skip that. So that's just sort of the opening here, but a lot of what I will talk about today centers on Africa's unsafe water burden, what we know about it, what are the questions we haven't answered yet around this sort of big body of literature, and then zoom in on gender and conclude with that, which is sort of what my title for the talk itself. So I can show many images or many graphs about access to water, access to safe water, and of course, Africa would always is bleeding really where a lot of the problem areas. So this is share of death attributed to unsafe water, where it's a major burden in the region when you think about it. But for me, I think what's challenging is that Africa is also urbanizing. quite fast, right? The rate has slowed down a little bit, but overall, we can think about a place where we have to ask the bigger question of, as our cities grow or become more dense, what do we do about water, right? It sounds simple, but it's still a major issue. I just came from Nairobi last May, where water losses because of weak water infrastructure is a major issue. The Nairobi started a water police department just to crack down on water losses. And all of that sort of fitting in the issue of weak infrastructure in these spaces where it's crowded. There are a lot of other issues sort of interplaying around water to deepen an issue. So for me, then the question is, if you think about urban Africa, are people water insecure because they are poor, or are they poor because they are water insecure? I think it's a bit of both, right? There's no direct answer to either, but when I write about water and urbanization and poverty in Africa, I try to draw attention to these kinds of dynamics. Your premise can be that there's some poverty in the urban fabric, especially if you think about housing and other challenges within these spaces. So if you are poor, then maybe there's some constraints on how you get your water, just by virtue of where you are, the infrastructure might not be there and other challenges, right? But you could also flip and argue the other way, that you are water insecure and therefore your quest to look for water might constrain your time in a way that might also lead to some poverty, right? Because you are investing time that otherwise would be devoted to productive ventures to looking for water, especially with women in Africa. So then the question is not just about the access, but also the quality within the urban space. So some of the argument here is that when you look at a typical urban environment in Africa, access is an issue, but quality is also a big issue. And there has been a tendency to always think that when it rains, there is more contaminant. We have more contaminants around water. But one thing we've been able to show within that context is that urban systems or urban contexts are so crowded when it comes to slums and urban informal settlement that seasonal changes in water contamination have become less important. What do I mean by that? It's basically that if you tested for water quality at a household level in a dry season and you did the same in a wet season, chances are that you wouldn't spot significant differences. Why is that important? It is because what it tells us is that if your interventions are very focused on just the wet season, you are missing out on a whole slew of contaminants that are still affecting water, because it's just by nature of the environment and less so that it's always raining. That's why we spot very little differences between whether it's wet season or whether it's dry season when we think about water in this environment. So now let me zoom in, just giving that context, to talk more about gender, which is like 1/3 of what I do. So there's the water insecurity and contamination bit of what I do, but a lot on gender. So I'm presenting, actually combining very ambitiously, 2 papers that I think speak to each other today that I want to share. So what do we know? It's very, I do something wrong. So that women are disproportionately burdened when it comes to water collection in Africa is not new, right? Let's just put it that women are primarily responsible for fetching water. So that's the premise. But the literature on women and water has actually grown quite a bit, right? To demonstrate impact on bodies to some degree, mental health burden of continuous water collection, impacts on children, or spinal injuries that might be as a result of continuous water collection, and a whole host of different things. But is water collection really that straightforward though? And I think a lot of what I'm trying to do is to move us away from water collection is burdensome. You move from point A to B, you might be walking a longer distance, and trying to really understand the nuances of what it takes to get your water if you are a woman in urban Africa. So I will leave this. This is a preamble in one of my papers. It would be too long to read, so I want to leave it for just a minute or less for you to just read it, and then I'll start unpacking what's going on in the context of the two papers that I'm presenting. And this is set in Malawi, Leo's country. All right, okay. So again, I wanted to move away from just say that water collection takes time and you walk a longer distance. So to a woman in urban Africa making a decision about water, there's much more going on than just get up, get your bucket and walk longer, or than just get up, go to a river and collect the water. So my goal has been to uncover some of these nuances around what it takes to get your water. Okay. So what are some of the things we don't know? One thing I wanted to emphasize in these two papers is that there is some temporal decision making around how you get your water. You might decide between the river that is nearby and the safe water that is further away, but that decision might not be the same every day, right? So what are the constraining factors at a household level that might shape what you decide to do every day in terms of how you get your water? Okay. The second gap I'm speaking to is that it's clear that men do not collect water primarily, right? But there's something more going on there. Boys collect water, men do not. So there's something more to understand, and that's my sort of masculinities part, where theoretically I'm just fascinated by the idea that a boy collects water and then once they marry, they stop collecting water because then it changes, right? So there's some cultural nuances to try to understand here. And then the final bit of this is water collection really goes beyond the household, right? That's even the WHO, UN, a lot of sort of global policy thinking around water is that water can make you sick. So there's this obsession over unsafe water that you drink. When I think about water and health, it's much more than consuming unsafe water. So there's some interest and fascination also in what does your water collection environment look like? And what does that do to your body, for example, right? Try to understand these nuances. Okay. I always said I have a lot of time. Yeah. So there are three objectives. Of course, looking at women's lived experiences around water, that's always the common factor. But try to zoom in on what we call water fetching risk or water collection risk. So try to map within a particular context or space, what kinds of risk are we concerned about when it comes to water collection? And then zoom in around sort of the gender relations to try to explain what might be going on. Because there are students who might be interested in theory, a lot of the work, at least that's how Leo trained me, there's always a theoretical discussion. You don't just collect your data and think about it. I don't want to go too deep into the theory, but political ecology of health is its own body of work that shows how we link power, obviously, to the body, or how we link power to unequal access to resources. Within the geographic, are those comments or something? But at the same time, in the last decade or so, we have really a proliferation of studies that are getting us to think about political ecology in terms of the human body, right? And so how do you think about collection of resources. It might be firewood, water, whatever, that people are collecting as a source of livelihood, and how we get to interpret the impacts on bodies in the context of power, right? So that's sort of what I'm deploying here to contribute to that literature, that if people's bodies and impacts of resource access or poor resource access can help us think much better about power and how it operates, then there's something that water collection can offer in terms of that understanding. And then the second theory I'm using is on masculinities, which I think within the water literature, all we do is that why are we not talking enough to the men? Or why are we not paying attention to what I call communal masculinity? So it's so much that women are collecting water, doing all these things, maybe to satisfy husbands. It's part of the social fabric. But there's much more going on there in terms of how both men and women think about these kinds of processes when it comes to the African context. Okay. And then also think about masculinities away from irrigation and governance, which is really where we see the bigger part of the literature, that women collect water, men make the decisions when it comes to governance of water, at least the broader trend that we know of. Okay. So just a large body of work over 2 years or 3 years, actually, that I've collected to sort of make these cases in these papers. But I think the most, I would say, creative part around this work, especially the first paper, is thinking about if we map water collection, just looking at a subset of women. And here we did about 26 or so, I believe. And we use this GoPro camera. It's a 360-degree camera that we just hang around people's neck with permission. And so it maps the spaces where you move to get your water. And then that enables us to map what kinds of risk we might be able to see. Okay. So we did that. Every participant gets a round trip to your water source. And then we code every single thing we see that could contribute, that could be risky. That might be a slippery environment, a bigger rock that you might topple over, short household doors that women might bend. And so we had to make a case for what constitutes risk. The reason why that was important is that our concept of risk was very different from the women's concept of risk. But we tried to make that case in the paper, that what you see as risk, somebody might interpret as I fall down every day and I just get up. So to me, that's just part of the way I interpret water collection. But nonetheless, that's important to know. So about 30 minutes in, I will share some of the results without boring you with a lot of the quotes from the paper. But I think one important argument we make here is that collecting water and juggling with household roles is actually quite complicated, right? It's the idea of what do you do for your kids, one, especially for families with kids. Number two, what you do for your husband. Number two, and what you do for your wider community, all sort of interplaying to shape the kinds of decisions women are making when you think about water. But a lot of my work have showed that, well, water collection takes time, right? And that it might take you 10 minutes to the water source, but you are waiting maybe an hour to get your water. But if we go back to the preamble that I shared, while you are waiting for your water, what else is happening that you are worried about? Is your baby maybe waking up and there's no one taking care of them? Or is your husband coming during lunchtime for tea and tea is not ready because you were queuing for water? So these nuances are important, okay? And so a lot of the juggling is really obviously about intermittent water supply. And there are a lot of social norms around why you wait for water and what you do as you wait. So here you will see just evidence of people who put the water, run back quickly to check on their baby, maybe come back hoping that nobody displays them in the queue. And these are they are important, right? But I think it's not just enough to say that you wait longer to get your water, because sometimes there's nobody there actually waiting, the water stop flowing. So it's important to sort of connect that kind of process with what is happening behind closed doors or what is happening at the household level. Okay. But how do I also justify when women are talking about water, what sorts of impacts are they highlighting the most? In this work, a lot of what we heard was, one, I want to really make sure that my household has water, which is, women understand that when it comes to water. But it's also about how do I carry water all the time that I think is affecting my beauty and how I appear to my husband. And this is sort of the kinds of narrative that I, unfortunately, have to try to make sense of. And sometimes these are just the social dynamics that are at play that we have to try to sort of tease. But what does the water fetching environment look? So there is what you do to get your water, and then there is the wider environmental contexts. And so these are just images, sort of captions from our 360-degree cameras, where we are connecting your water collection with risk exposure in a way that I think we should do more about, and just say that there might be a sharp object, but what exactly did we find that can constitute risk? You can think about slippery environments during rainy times. You can think about ditches. And we have a whole, I wanted to show, sort of different codes of what we called risk that we coded. And for just 26 women, we were able to code over 440 or so risk. And these are the risks that we categorize here into what is terrain, sort of where are you actually passing to get your water in your quest to go faster, in your quest to avoid having to wait longer. But also thinking about how are houses built in these spaces in a way that might compromise or constitute risk. And in Malawi, a lot of what we found was how short the doors were in Bangwe, in Blantyre. And so there's constant sort of bending while you're carrying the water to try to get in your house. If I was studying this without really getting into what the women are saying, you're like, well, it's normal, doors are just like that. But you hear a lot of constant back pain that they themselves will link to, I think, is this constant bending to sort of get my water into either that, or you have to lower the water and so while carrying a heavy bucket of water, get inside. So that's just all the codes. So I'll share a few more results and then try to share what they all sort of mean when we think about embodiment or emotional embodiment. I think another important aspect to this is really the decision-making around these risks and how women are prioritizing. Do you go for a safe water or unsafe? What kinds of parameters are you considering? Okay. So I can't see this here, but I'll just leave it just briefly to think about what kinds of considerations are ongoing here. You know some of the risks, not all of them. You know that you need safe water at the household level. But what else are you considering? Obviously, cost is a big part, right? And so are you deciding to go to a closer nearby source because it saves you time, but you know that costs you more money? So there's a lot of work that we try to do to understand these kinds of trade-offs. What makes one person choose the closer source as opposed to a source that might be further away? How much of that is linked to some awareness of the risk that might be in that space? A lot of water is carried even on cover, right? And so are you aware that there are some contamination that could happen considering what kinds of spaces you walk or where you pass while carrying water? This is another mapping just to show just a few participants and what kinds of considerations that people might make as they try to get their water, right? And so again, cost is important. The idea of safety, whether a tap was functional the previous day and you are hoping that today it might flow. So all these considerations, we can map them, just try to see. If you sketch a woman's decision-making from the household all the way to when they got the water and back, how would that tree look like in terms of, it's all mental processing. You are making decisions as you go. in terms of where to go, how much to spend on water, and all these other processes. And then I'll just get into the masculinities. Of course, I'm fitting a lot in here. I think that there's a whole section in the paper where I think about, so what kinds of negotiations are happening between women and husbands around water? So these negotiations, I'll just share a few examples. I think they are important. That there's something I called in the paper spatial mobility constraints, that, okay, men, when the water is not flowing, can go to other communities to look for water. It wasn't very easy for women to do that. So one, the water is not flowing, but there's no easy sort of pursuit of water without some sort of a negotiation about, well, I might be longer coming home, that means lunch might delay because the immediate water isn't available. And so I have to sort of negotiate. But like I said, it was easy for men, for boys to do that, right? And so we think about, why are these spaces, why are boys allowed in those spaces but men aren't when we think about water collection? And this is an African Studies Center. It's not to challenge the norms. It's more to uncover more and try to understand what is actually going on. That plays into water collection labor and how we understand it, so that we are not thinking about water collection just as merely point A to B, but really broadening our understanding of what goes into that kind of decision-making on a daily basis, or even less temporal basis beyond the day. But when we think about communal masculinities, what do we learn from this work? It's also how spaces get constructed, right? So I just want to point to one space here. The more gallons you see in the queue, the more it means they are boys queuing. Okay, so we sort of have to look at how those gendered spaces are constructed. But why is that? Is that women, of course, were more likely to collect water with buckets. Men masculinize the process by carrying bulk gallons that can carry more water, and therefore less rounds or less trips to these water sources. But I want to point your attention to something I found in Malawi. I don't know if Leo is aware of this or not. And that is, in Kauma and other informal settlements where I've done my work, there is the creation of what they call bachelor's taps, which became an important piece of just me thinking about masculinities. Bachelor's taps were basically communities that recognized that water was a big issue, but also recognized that the older men that were unmarried still had shame collecting water, so they could actually devote certain taps just for bachelors. Now, if there were no bachelors around, other people could collect water from there. That we confirmed. But bachelors, which means they are not boys, they are older men, but they were unmarried, so there were no women to do the water collection, had priority to use those kinds of those water sources. Where you had boys and women, sometimes, like I said, the segregation was very clear, that the men are grouped on one side, they are bachelors, they don't want to mingle. So I would like to just conclude in another 5 minutes or so. So this is where I started, trying to understand some of the challenges, lived experiences around water, the health impacts in terms of the spaces where water collection happens, and then thinking about masculinities here. So first conclusion, I think that when we think about water collection labor here, I think the everyday emotions of women talking about water is important to understand that, well, tomorrow I know water flow will still be intermittent, but what is my decision-making like? And so that emotional thinking around what am I going to do? I have a baby, I have a family to feed, I have a husband who comes home at lunch hoping that the tea is ready. It's my goal to sort of try to uncover these pieces and how they fit together. Okay. I think Thinking about women and broader marital relations around water is important also, right? That I am talking masculinities, but the women are more about how do our husbands view us and our roles around water. If I'm unable to provide tea at lunch, I gave this talk somewhere, I think Nebraska School of Atmospheric Sciences, where somebody said, well, why can't the men just make their tea if the women are out collecting water, right? So that's to put it simply, right? Just make your tea. Why should a man's ability to take tea during lunch be a woman's problem? But a lot of that was women saying that, well, the man goes to work to bring money and I'm home, and the burden of collecting water, I know it's on me because I have to make sure there is food. So there's a whole negotiation going on. For example, when there isn't water, how are women negotiating with husbands? One is, could you bathe with half a bucket, right? As opposed to full bucket. Another negotiation might sound like, can I do your laundry with the river water? But the man says, that stains my clothes for work the next day. So there's a whole negotiation there. And I think it's important to understand those sort of masculine and feminine tendencies and how they shape just how we understand access to water in general. So I think I've already shared this, men's notions of masculinity. An important piece that I didn't say is that over 70% of men provided money for water. Their understanding of water is that I made money available, but you go look for the water, right? But one thing that's striking is that why are men more willing to contribute to water collection when they can masculinize the process? So men who had bicycles were more willing, because there was something about taking your bicycle to the water point and tying a lot of gallons and riding the bike away as opposed to carrying the water, which was viewed more feminine, right? So that's all I have, and those are my acknowledgements. I work with a lot of groups, water boards in Malawi, University of Sterling, collaborators, and others. Thank you, and I'm ready for a conversation.
Can start questions. Anybody has questions, and then we go to questions from audience.
All right, go ahead. Yes.
So one of the big challenges, particularly in the context of changing climate, but even before that, is the unpredictability of rains.
Yes.
So, I mean, part of that's modulated by the physical variability of that system. How in this areas that you've been looking at, how do they cope, for example, in Malawi, when the Indian Ocean dipole is in one direction or another, and things are shifting in terms of water availability?
Yeah, so I can speak to the drinking water context. I actually think we know very little about piped water systems and climate change. It's easier to predict with the groundwater systems, right? So rural boreholes and others, the tables are lowering and then it's taking more effort. In the context I work, these are actually piped water systems, but there's still a question there about why piped water systems are becoming more vulnerable to climate change, right? Because there's some space between the booster station getting the water to communities and how much of the water actually flows. When I started my PhD here, my hypothesis was always that it's just NGOs and community groups overloading the system by building too many pipes without enhancing the booster stations. I think that's beginning to change with more variability, but we need a lot more work. But coping usually is just diverting to the secondary sources, basically, here. So if the piped water is your primary source, Malawi's urbanization is interesting in that there are a lot of urban communities that still somehow look rural from certain areas. So what that would mean is that there were boreholes before piped water made it. And there are people who have lived there long enough that they see the boreholes as well as the newer sort of pipe systems. So the boreholes are dry, you go to the pipe system hoping it's available. If that's not available, you hope that one day maybe the boreholes are working, right? So that's really how that's sort of the spatial navigation of trying to cope. And then there's the household one, which is, different things like cooking with less food, all these other things you do just so your water takes you further than it usually would. Maybe you can add. Yes, yes.
So in these systems,
yes,
where there is, as you've illustrated, risk associated not only with the time loss, but the process of retrieving water.
yes.
You've advocated for an increased role with men into the system. How do you have that conversation when there's little incentive for those men to join into the system when there are issues of pride that prevent them from joining the system, and the power dynamics are in their favor?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think that, I've tried to have this conversation in Malawi, Ghana, everywhere, Kenya, everywhere in Africa where I do this work. And sometimes what I come back to is that as we wait for the systems to change, can we lower the impact on women, right? So I think you would always have to sort of navigate this masculine, system where previously maybe some men didn't care that the women even had money to fetch water. They sort of brag about, well, now we actually make sure there's money. They should just look for the water. It's almost like a staggered system of different things impacting women. I think it comes down to first solving the communal water problem, right? If it's less time to wait, maybe it makes the change sort of easier, right? Looking at least the context that I'm looking at. So that's my response to the argument. And it's not easy because, those of you who study cultural dynamics within these spaces, I think I'm always careful about my argument here, right? There are a lot of different things happening within these spaces, like a woman whose husband is around, but asks the husband to then get a boy who is unmarried to fetch the water. So that other negotiations that I didn't even get into, that's all happening until it gets to where, but could I also really say men with bicycles collect water, so we should give men bicycles? It just doesn't make sense to me that is tackling sort of the cultural underpinnings of these kinds of negotiations. So that's what I can say. People probably more knowledgeable about African culture than me. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. That's an interesting part. The bachelor's cups, and that's a new one on me. And there was a time I had lived in that township, but my brother used to live there and go there on holidays. But have you seen, does necessity play a role in that? Because I know growing in a family, a big family of 11 kids, but for us there were only 3 girls and 8 boys.
Okay.
And so, and at certain points in the household, and maybe the girls were gone, they were in school and all that, so there would just be boys there.
Who would do
so
that?
We used to do things that were not, so I would clean pots and scrub them and all that. We would even pound maize. We just made sure that it was, it was hidden. And
I see. That's, the taboo.
If it was me to do this, you gotta pay. So have you seen some of that necessity can also drive men to do so?
Yeah, so when I looked at my data, the instances where men proudly talked about supporting water collection was when their wives were pregnant, for example. But the interesting thing with the men is that they want to make it clear to the women at the water point that I'm here because my wife is pregnant, just to try to get away from that taboo of I am the one doing it. So there it changes from the pride, the taboo of being a man collecting water, to the pride of a man helping a pregnant wife, right? So these were all sort of they were just very simple cases. The bachelor type system was just very striking to me. One other thing was the women, when a man comes, would actually let the man get ahead of the queue in a lot of water points. It's very common there that, we don't want the man staying too long. But the women didn't want the man staying too long too, because they thought other women talked about them when their husbands were there collecting water, right? So how much of gender can we really understand? Yes. a lot of sort of fascinating things. Yeah.
At what age do the young boys become bachelors? So like, where is this transition where it's okay for them to collect water and then it turns into this idea that now they're of age to be considered?
Yeah, good question. I think a lot of this was when they've left home. So they are not married, but they've left home. So they are still on their own. So now you need to get your water, but you are not married yet. So that's sort of my sense of what was going on there. Big enough to not be dependent, which makes you question whether they're just getting away, but that's sort of so there wasn't like a clear-cut age. I didn't actually interrogate that, but a bachelor in that sense would be you're no longer with your parents. You're just big enough to be on your own, but waiting to get married so someone else takes off your water needs. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I am thinking, what is your research policy implication or social change? Because the social change that you're suggesting, because I'm thinking, by reading this paper, if I go to area as an activist,
Yes.
should I think about the role of men and women in collecting water, look at that and try to make equilibrium there? Or I'm questioning the broader system that has causes this, or maybe the masculinity that exists is what it also perpetuates the broader system. So I wanted to know what is the
Yeah, very good question. I don't know that a pathway to just go in and try to change the system is the easiest part. So that's where I come back to, can water access be easier, right? And maybe it limits how much of this. The ultimate would be that there's actually tap water in every house, right? And so I would think that if water is at home, it sort of adulterates or minimizes this impact. And that's the whole reason why I'm like, well, it's women, it's not just about walking, it's about all the spaces where they are passing to also get the water. So for me, I come back to access to water improving, gradually in a way that limits that kind of impact. But it's important that, if I didn't do this work, I never knew about bachelor's tabs. And so we talk about masculinity and water in a very casual way, that men don't collect water. Well, what else is going on, right? So I think there's much more about just our own understanding of what I call masculinity at the community level. It's these spaces that limits women's mobility in a way that, like you said, perpetuates access to water in a way that makes it even harder. Yeah. For the Q&A. From your studies, was anything mentioned that negatively affected pregnant women during water collection? I didn't focus on that per se, but we have a new study actually looking at water collection from late pregnancy all the way to postpartum, which I'm doing with my wife, who also works on maternal care. So there's some work to understand. So these same burdens, I said men are helping. Do the expectations around water collection evolve with stages in pregnancy, like when you are heavily pregnant versus maybe early prepartum and different stages, and how we can better understand that. So that's what I can. Can you speak more how outside influence affects women and how that could change? For example, if there's a foreign company that buys land and makes women use a different, more risky route, how would the men see it could be too risky for women and shift to helping more? That's hard for me to tell. I think this question is almost getting at what if the women own the water? So if an NGO came in, built and said, these water sources are functional and they are for the women, do I see that as a potential solution? Ownership is already its own politics too, right? And I've done a whole work on women and water governance in Malawi, where there are always limits with things like educational level, different things that disadvantage women from taking up these positions. But a lot of the work also showed that women are just reluctant. They're like, let the men talk to the government, we would. So, it's a whole system. And that's why we can understand it bit by bit and try to continue, working in this space. Yes, please.
I was wondering if you could reflect on your positionality as a
researcher and how that might affect your ability to gather, or the information is constrained when you're interviewing. So if you're talking with women as a male researcher and men about water collection, like how does that differentiate that experience?
That's a very, very good question. I do have a whole paper on positionality in terms of an African doing research in another African country. I think it's very fascinating. It forces you to think very deeply. A lot of this work, I don't even speak fluent Chichewa, so I rely on a lot of female research assistants for this kind of work. And sometimes I'm sort of in the background trying to. The way positionality affects my findings is sometimes I don't know how much to bash my own African culture versus just try to explain what's going on. And I think that's important for me to acknowledge as a researcher, right? And sometimes it sort of hampers sort of the kind of bold declarations I could make. And I think that goes on to the question that we just had here, right? So which of this should be understood strictly as culture? That's understood by those within that culture. But if my work also shows that women are reporting spinal injuries if they started collecting water, say from teenage all the way to adult, I think it's important to have that conversation about what the impacts are beyond what we might know or consider, right? And for me, there were things like a woman says, I slipped and I fell and I broke my bucket, so I have to go back to get water. When you have that discussion with them, it was very striking to me that they were not concerned so much about the bodily impacts of that fall, but rather the fact that you have to go again to get the water. It sort of says something about priorities and how, so these are part of the fabric to the degree where what you really discuss as risk might not be viewed as risk by the people who are experiencing that, right? I think those are all important to uncover, but again, try to balance your interpretation with what a cultural system looks like. Yeah, I hope that helps. Yes.
I'm wondering, it sounds like that there's a specific time of day that the women and some of the bachelor men or whoever get water. But let's say you're a male and you're unmarried, you want to save face. What's to stop you from going at 2 in the morning when no one's there?
The taps are closed by then.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so the pipe systems usually have a vendor. They open during the day. So the vendors usually, it's only the boreholes that are often unlocked, but those are very unpredictable and unreliable. So that's the issue with that, going at 2 a.m. to get your water, right? Yeah. Yes.
I was wondering if the kind of setting that you're talking about, we have the city, and then we have the area where you talk about the slums.
Yes.
And what you're saying is most common with slums.
Yes, yes.
Like, for example, when you go to Kibera slums,
yes, Kibera,
you find, these pipe water systems that are not functional, or maybe sometimes the water is just not there and stuff like that. So do we have this category for this kind of settings in the city? And then the other aspect of masculinity and all this, it comes back even to the local settings, because we have our customary norms of, the man of the house. So you just direct things around and bring money to this. But one interesting thing that I've learned is with the medium-sized towns.
Yes.
So the young men, some young men, bought donkeys and some donkey carts, and they're using these carts and the donkeys to collect several jerrycans of water.
Yes.
And they deliver to houses that have, these water needs. But this is restricted. Again, I've only observed this in medium-sized towns. So I don't know how applicable that could be to city settings, but again, there are restrictions to that, right?
That's a very good question. So one thing I've continuously thought about is, I think one hypothesis would be where you have less entrepreneurial activity around water, maybe this is more likely. That's yet to be proven. That would be my hypothesis with everything I know around water. The reason is that if you take cities like Niamey, Accra, there is much more entrepreneurial activity around water and water vending. So women are moving less to water. Water is coming to them. But water is coming to them from who? It's the men who are hauling to sell. But doesn't that beg an interesting question about if water can be very feminine, why are men likely to participate if it's a venture that you make money off of, as opposed to helping somebody at home collect water? Granted that those who are hauling are, of course, using gallons. So it's rare that you will see a man carrying water to go and sell. They are usually sort of macho type, showing off, I'm strong, I can use a stick or a donkey, whatever the mode of transportation may be. So that's sort of my response to that question. But I always get fascinated by how about I talk to these men? So could you have a man who doesn't collect water at home but sells water to other people in the community? Because you could probably find that. Because then they move away from the domain of where they are known to a domain that's purely a market space, right? Yeah, so that would be my response, but that's very interesting. It's a very long question, so suggest to help women save time, fetching water or allocate to other activities. Yeah, I mean, in the context of Malawi, I think time itself is a very interesting dynamic around water, right? Because if you make the argument that if water access was better, you could sort of divert the time to other productive ventures. I see that more in Ghana, not so much in Malawi, because a lot of the work is domestic, right? So you save the time. So that time savings is helping you do more at home and not necessarily something that's the revenue generation for you. That's still important, but it's really how we interpret time and how time savings become important for women when we think about water collection and other things also. Yeah.
I'll just jump in there. It's interesting about time saving.
Yeah.
I do some work on cook stoves as well, like more these improved cook stoves, and we've been playing around with a very highly efficient cook stove that essentially converts the wood into a gas in the same process, and then you're using wood or pellets, but you're essentially almost cooking like with gas because they're called gasifiers. And we did a survey in Lilongwe about how perceptions, but the biggest value that people say it was time saving. They said the biggest benefit of using this stuff,
right?
Most important one was time saving. And you'd have stories like, I used to wake up at 5 a.m. to get my family ready to cook breakfast and all that. But now I can wake up at 6 and still cook food fast enough to do those kinds of things. So I think the value of time, and when you're promoting stoves like that, nobody is going and using that information. Oh, you're gonna save time. Take this stove, right? So some of those understandings like that will help us to target policy. Yeah. And I just wanted to say how those law doors. Yeah. They really just disqualify me from fetching water.
Oh, I thought about you. Those shadows, yes. Leo would have to bend like all the way down.
I have to kneel and crawl.
Yes, yeah. Yes.
How much negotiating of community, like women who had babies, would get water for other women while they watch their children? Like, is there any negotiating that kind of community support so that we're helping each other out so you won't be concerned about having to leave your children?
Yeah, very good question. So a lot of those negotiations actually happen at the water point where, let me go watch my kid. Can you watch my bucket so I don't get displaced? So those social norms were more at the point of getting the water, but it still had implications at what was happening at home, right? And so today, can you watch my bucket? So that I feel I can do a whole work on water collection norms around the water point. There's such women and agency in terms of what is happening. Different rules about you might come with 10 buckets, but you only allowed one until we go all the way to the end of the queue. There's always new things coming up, but one is certainly that I have things to do at home. But it's not just the babies. Sometimes women miscalculate how much time it would take to get the water. So a lot of the complaints we had was, I thought it would take me just 10 minutes. So I left my food on the stove to go back and it's burnt and I have to restart the cooking process. And that's my point about as you are getting water, what really is going on in your mind? And it's a lot, right? These kinds of things that you have to think about besides just getting the water as well. Yeah. Yes.
In the work that
Yeah.
besides negotiations between men and women,
Yes.
I'm curious if there are also negotiations across age.
Can you?
So,
yeah.
If we have a bunch of women at the water point, we're negotiating, right? But is there something to be said about how maybe elder women will get access as opposed to a younger woman? Or an older and married woman as opposed to a younger, things like that.
Yes, and that's almost the reverse of my answer. Here, those negotiations are almost happening at the household level in a lot of sort of what we got from our transcripts is that older, less capable women usually would get support. But that support often comes from girls, younger girls, because older women still have their own issues to deal with. So they often got support to get water because you might be immobile, you cannot. You just simply cannot get your own water. And there's a whole, it's more informal. So it might be your neighbor, but it's not like a whole organized system of support. But it did happen.
So I think that will be it for today.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
And sharing the results, we
Thank
appreciate
you.
it. And thank you for people who joined us online too. See you next time.